Hey, hi, hello. Welcome to Diana Emerson today. We're listening to Secrets of the Morgue, and this is Into the Wilderness.
There are two ways to come into the world and an infinite number of ways to leave it. She disappeared off the face of the earth. Ground just opened up and swallowed her up.
Zilpha's family describes her as the one making everybody laugh, no matter what the situation was.
Something will propel the killer into this rage that they then lash out.
There are some people in this world that will go out of their way to tell something that isn't the truth.
Just clear that there had been massive blunt trauma.
He's like a spider web, just one vital suspect to another vital suspect to another vital suspect.
This blood was just lying there, waiting for someone to come and tell its story. A shocking murder becomes a dark mystery. The victim's body holds the key to convicting the killer. Every fiber is a clue. Every wound is a piece of the puzzle. In these cases, it's up to the medical examiner to find the crucial evidence and catch the murderer. This is Secrets of the Morgue.
McDowell County is a rural area in the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains, western North Carolina.
It's a small county with a big heart. People here always get behind each other.
It's beautiful. It's not too crowded. Folks have a little elbow room to work with. Lake James is a man-made lake here in the county. Most of it's forested.
On a chilly winter morning, a gruesome discovery spoils the natural beauty.
A couple of hunters are out there going along the shoreline and working around the edge of the lake, and they come across some bones wrapped in a sheet or a towel. The hunters do the first thing that comes to mind, which is call the sheriff's department.
It was pretty well obvious that these remains that they had located were human. There isn't anything at the scene that makes it completely obvious whose remains these are.
Police fear the bones could be those of a missing local woman named Zilpha Lowry.
She comes to mind as a possibility.
Sylph was a young woman at the time she disappeared, 24 years old. She was popular locally. Her family loved her. She seemed to have been a free spirit.
Zilpha's family describes her as the family jokester. She liked to party, always having fun, the one making everybody laugh, no matter what the situation was.
Police spend 7 months looking for the young woman.
Anytime you have a missing persons case, you have to look at it with an eye toward, could this be another kind of case? Has this person met with some sort of foul play, or is this person missing because they want to be missing?
The first step is to determine the identity of the bones found at Lake James. They're sent to Chief Medical Examiner, Dr. John Butts.
Forensic pathology is a very broad field, and you see a lot of different things. What appeals to me is that we are problem solvers. We're presented with puzzles, riddles, and we gather the information, put the pieces together, and come up with conclusions. We were notified by the authorities that they had found these remains, and they suspected that they belonged to Miss Lowry. We'll take the remains and we'll lay them out in an anatomical configuration. they have clearly been out in the environment for a considerable length of time. There's very little attached flesh.
Without skin, standard methods of identification like fingerprinting are out of the question, but the bones do offer certain clues.
The hip bone, the heads, the femurs, the humeri, and the size of the mastoid bones behind the ears tell us that we're looking at a woman. To determine age, we look at signs of wear on the bones. We look at the vertebrae to see if they begin to get spurs on them. We can see that all of the growth plates have matured. And this tells us this individual is probably up into their 20s.
The evidence suggests the remains could be Zilpha Lowry, but the findings must be verified.
Dental examination is the way that we identify the majority of decomposed skeletonized remains. But dental exam only works if you have enough restoration and changes in your dentition to separate you from other individuals.
Dr. Butts compares Zilpha's dental records to the teeth found near Lake James.
She has no fillings, she's no restorations, so she's had very good teeth. There aren't a lot of unique features to them.
With nothing specific to match, Dr. Butts must find another way to identify the remains. He takes detailed x-rays of the skull.
The frontal sinuses, the little spaces we have in our frontal bone, each individual has a unique pattern. We have some excellent x-rays taken during Ms. Lowry's life, and we're able to compare the two sets of x-rays. We see multiple areas where she has unique features. And on that basis, we're able to definitively state who this individual is. Zilpha Lowry was, in fact, the remains that we have lying in front of us.
Now we know that it wasn't a case of a young girl who had just taken off in some other part of the country to live. We knew that Zilpha was dead.
It's never a pleasant thing to go tell a family that their loved one's not coming home. Just not knowing, I think, can drive a family crazy sometimes. And even if the news is not good, sometimes the knowing can almost be easier to deal with than the not knowing.
Investigators are determined to discover how Zilpha ended up dead and abandoned in the wilderness. They turn to the medical examiner for answers.
Part of our charge always in a death investigation is trying to determine why that person is deceased. One of the things we're looking for is evidence of injuries. So we see some injuries consistent with scavenging animals, but we see other injuries that are completely unrelated and would never have been caused by animals, and these were confined to the head. So the skull was severely fragmented. In order to figure out what happened to it, we really had to reconstruct it, that is, take the pieces and fasten them, glue them back together again to see what they could tell us. And then get some good photographs and prepare a diagram to document exactly what's going on. We don't actually have all of the skull bones. There's some parts, particularly the right side of the skull, where the bones are missing.
Even without the full picture, Dr. Butts is able to determine what killed Zilpha.
It's just clear that there had been massive blunt trauma.
In most forensic cases, context is important. And the context is at the crime scene. You have to understand what happened in order to make a correlation with what you're looking at on the body.
If these remains were found at the bottom of a cliff, lying on some rocks, and the injuries were caused by falling on your head, it's possible that this was an accident or even a suicide. when they're found in a place where there's no way to explain those injuries, then we have to infer that they were inflicted on her, that someone did this to her.
Her skull was more or less crushed. Pretty clearly indicate a homicide.
Zilpha's murder sends shockwaves through the county. Investigators are determined to bring her killer to justice. They begin by examining the days leading up to her disappearance.
Zilpha was a waitress at the truck stop and had worked a double shift and was waiting for a ride home. And that was the last time she was seen. She had friends, there were times that she would go off for a day or two, and the family or close friends wouldn't worry about her. But after so many days had gone by, they began to think something was wrong.
She was known to have said that she was meeting her ex-old man afterward.
Johnny was her ex-husband, and they had some rocky times. It was an on and off relationship.
Johnny had gone to prison. I mean, they had separated and divorced while he was in prison.
As we always know, one of the first people you look at in a true whodunit is the spouse or the ex-spouse. So he was immediately a person of interest in the case.
Investigators have a lead on a suspect in the violent killing of 24-year-old Zilpha Lowry.
Zilpha had known a local man named Johnny. They had gotten married. Zilpha had been pregnant at the time, and their child died in infancy, and they separated.
There were a number of people interviewed who had some suspicions around Johnny.
You start with the husband, and you start with an ex-husband if there is one, and you get their version of events, you alibi them out, and at the end of that, they're either still in the investigation or you have eliminated them.
I went out and interviewed Johnny. And when I asked him about Zilpha's disappearance and subsequent murder, he was like, don't know nothing about it, never heard it, never. It's just my ex, that's all.
There are some people in this world that, for whatever reason, and particularly when they're wanting to talk to law enforcement, that don't want to tell the truth and will go out of their way to tell something that isn't the truth. And Johnny was one that kind of fits in that category.
Johnny's cagey behavior puts him high on the list of suspects, even with an alibi.
The date that she disappeared was always a little bit fuzzy. So any alibi that someone could offer is always going to be a little bit fuzzy because you're not able to match that up with a given date. And you're talking to people in April or May of the year after, or in some cases it was years later, and somebody's not going to be able to say where they were July of 1993.
The hazy timeline for Zilpha's disappearance makes it that much harder for investigators to link a suspect to the crime.
Johnny was certainly the suspect throughout the investigation,
but there was simply no evidence to connect him to.
With Zilpha's remains as their only evidence, Dr. Bugs continues to study the bones in the hopes that they might give investigators insight into the killer.
The skull is severely fragmented. The type of force that's required to break the skull in that fashion, you can't get that by swatting somebody with something soft. You can't get that by kicking them or punching them. It's got to be a heavy object to fracture the skull. At the back of the head was an area that almost was sort of punched out. And that's a very typical pattern we see with an object that has a bit of a point to it, where the forces are concentrated over a relatively small area, like with a hammer.
The damage patterns on Zilpha's reconstructed skull suggest the perpetrator killed on emotion and impulse.
When somebody's been killed by blunt force trauma to the head with some kind of weapon, whether it's a hammer or a shovel or whatever, that's generally one indication of a disorganized or unplanned murder.
These signs point to the fact that this was a crime of passion.
Zilphia had more than one romantic interest, and that became a cause for concern in terms of the motive to kill her or to do her harm in some way.
Confident that this was a crime of passion, detectives take a hard look at the men in Zilpha's life.
He was like a spider web, one viable suspect to another viable suspect to another viable suspect.
But police can't establish a solid link to any friends or to regular customers from the truck stop.
Those dead ends can be very frustrating.
Investigators scrutinized male relatives.
Jeremiah Pittman was Zilphia's nephew, and he had actually gone missing some weeks or months before Zilphia was reported missing.
He was extremely hard on Zilpha because they were so close in age and had basically grown up together.
It's a stunning development in the case. Two young people missing from the same family raise red flags for the detectives.
Zilphia had been making efforts to try to locate Jeremiah. She apparently had some pretty strong thoughts that his father, Eddie Pittman, may have been involved with his disappearance.
Detectives look into the conflicts in Zilpha's family.
There had been some bad blood over some forged signatures on a deed. And I think that it had gotten to a point where Jeremiah had confronted his father. And they thought that maybe Eddie had done something to Jeremiah at that point.
That made him a person of interest in Zilpha's case. When two members of the same family disappear, there's always a suspicion that that might be connected.
I remember myself and our chief deputy at the time going down there to meet with Eddie and Rosemary to talk to them about this whole situation. Chief deputy had gone in one room with Eddie, and I went in another room with Rosemary. We were talking about the fact that we were here trying to figure out what had happened to Jeremiah. Rosemary said, "I don't know and I don't care."
Rosemary is not only cold and callous, she's uncooperative. Zilpha's ex-brother-in-law, Eddie, is just as unhelpful.
Eddie really felt like his son was a free-spirited someone and might just go to another area and live.
Eddie denies knowing what happened to his son and to Zilpha, but investigators realize he's got a short fuse, and that matches the MO of Zilpha's murder.
Rage is a very central emotion within crimes of passion. Something will unfold that will propel them into this rage that they then lash out and kill the victim.
Eddie was evil. I think the whole family suspected that he had killed Jeremiah and that it played a role in Zilpha's murder.
Investigators suspect Zilpha's ex-brother-in-law could be involved in her murder.
We had talked to Rosemary and Eddie a number of times. Not only Zilphia's case, but Jeremiah's case, trying to determine if the two were connected.
During the many interviews with the suspects, Dudley Green gains Rosemary's trust.
Ultimately, one day, Rosemary walks into the sheriff's office, asks to see me. I've talked with her a number of times at that point. I brought her into my office. So I said, "How can I help you today, Rosemary?" She said, "Well, I think Eddie Pittman's going to kill me." And I asked the question, "Well, why do you think he would want to kill you, Rosemary?" And she said, "Well, because of what I can tell you about his son." And I said, "Are you telling me you think he's had something to do with Jeremiah's disappearance?" So she said, "I know he did. I saw it."
Rosemary Gary came forward and said that she had been there when Eddie killed Jeremiah.
Rosemary Gehring led the officers to Jeremiah's body.
She walked up to that ditch where we started digging, and she said, "You're in the wrong place. It's about 5 feet that way." They moved the equipment. We started digging in another area. Again, weren't finding anything. She said, "You're not deep enough. It's deeper." She was almost able to tell us down to the exact foot where those remains were located.
They dug up the grave where they found Jeremiah's bones.
For long years after Zilpha's nephew disappeared, investigators find his remains and his killer.
Eddie Pittman was charged with that murder.
I will never forget that arrest. Myself and another officer went in to speak with Eddie, told him he was under arrest, and he said, "What am I being arrested for?" And I said, "For murder." And he looked at me and he said, "Whose murder?" Again, there's another thing that leads you to believe he could be involved with Zilpha's murder.
If Eddie Pittman can kill his own son, he can kill anybody.
There's another chilling parallel with Zilpha's murder.
Zilpha and Jeremiah's remains have an alarming number of similarities. They both have blunt trauma to the head that raises the concern that the same person had murdered them.
Investigators press Eddie Pittman on his involvement in Zilpha's murder.
Eddie said he had nothing to do with it.
The suspicion had always been that Eddie Pittman was connected to the Zilpha case, but it turned out there was no sufficient connection to ever bring a charge against him.
Investigators spend years exhausting every lead, chasing hundreds of tips, and looking for new evidence.
You come to a dead end and you go back and you start over from square one. That happened a number of times. But this is not one of those cases that you just go home and stop thinking about for the weekend. It's with you. You're trying to process all this information that you know and how this interview that you've done today connects with an interview you did 2 months ago, and what are the differences or what are the similarities? Where's the truth laying in there? So yeah, it can be extremely frustrating.
There were many feasible suspects throughout the years, and so that's what made it so difficult for those officers. They felt like, okay, now I think we've got it, and then it just dissipates. For the family, it was just a tough road.
11 years after the discovery of Zilpha's remains, investigators hope advancements in forensic science will offer new clues.
We realize now DNA is a technology that's going to be out there, and at some point in time, we may need to have a sample of Zilpha's DNA.
Our State Bureau Investigation Laboratory in North Carolina had been able to get good DNA profiles from pulp of teeth. So it was decided that they would exhume her remains.
The family didn't want to be a part of Zilpha's exhumation. They said they had already buried her one time and didn't want to have to go through all the emotions of having to do it again. But they gave the consent and their blessing to do whatever needed to be done to get the case solved.
As traumatic as the exhumation process can be, the team believes Zilpha's DNA is their best shot at identifying the killer.
When the remains were brought back to us, I collected 4 molar teeth, put them in a bag, and then those were turned over to the State Bureau Investigation here in North Carolina. They extract the material from the central part of the tooth, and if there was enough cellular material in there, they could get a DNA profile from it.
While the state laboratory builds Zilpha's DNA profile, investigators work with the media.
I would talk to Dr. Green, who was then the lead investigator in the case, on a daily basis, pretty much about this case. And we were always trying to come up with new articles to put out so that it would stay fresh on people's minds. So if anybody had heard anything or knew anything, that they might would call in with some information.
Rochelle's feature article on the unsolved murder elicits a response from a dubious source.
An individual who was incarcerated in jail who came forward and said he felt like he had some knowledge about the Lowry case.
These jailhouse informants. They are hoping that by giving you information, you'll do them a favor and maybe reduce the sentence or get them into another cell block. And that's what clouds the information that you get. So you have to be very suspect as an investigator.
The tip comes from Ronald Wayne McMahon, who's serving 2 years for speeding and eluding police.
Ronald is in jail on an unrelated charge. And Ronald gives us some information about a guy named Robin. And another guy who was living in a mobile home here in the west end of McDowell County.
He says during his conversation with detectives that these 2 men had murdered Zilpha.
After more than a decade of relentless investigation into the murder of Zilpha Lowry, detectives get a break in the case. Investigators have a fresh lead on 2 new suspects in the killing of Zilpha Lowry.
The detectives had asked the family about Bobby and Robin. Nobody knew anything about them. Still didn't have last names. Still didn't know where these fellas lived. Anything.
Detectives question county residents and re-interview Ronald McMahon. They search landlord-tenant records going back more than a decade.
Did some late work here, and we were able to find where Robin's ex-wife, he had married a McDowell County girl, and they had separated sometime before Zilphia disappeared. She thought it was likely he had gone back to the Richlands, Virginia area. So I asked a couple of the guys that I work with, let's go to Richlands and have a face-to-face with him.
Robin had a family at that point.
He had apparently gotten pretty involved in his local church up there, and to the best of my understanding, attending that pretty regularly. During that initial conversation, Robin ultimately acknowledged that Zilphia had been over to his house on at least one occasion. But to the best of his recollection, she was alive and well when she left. He was able to tell us a little bit more information about who Bobby was. Bobby Taylor was actually at that time in federal prison on other charges.
While investigators gather more information on Robin Whitehead and Bobby Taylor, the laboratory completes Zilpha Lowry's DNA profile.
The DNA was a standard that can then be used to identify unknowns that were found in other locations and link individuals or places to her death. So if they had a blood spatter somewhere and then they could match it to a DNA profile of Miss Lowry, then they could say that that blood was Miss Lowry's rather than somebody else's.
We knew where Zilpha was found, but we at that point had no idea where she was murdered. And the first clue that we had to where it might be was when Robin Whitehead told where it was that he lived.
To link Robin to Zilpha's murder, detectives look for proof she was in his home and possibly killed there.
So the officers go out and they find this trailer. The trailer hadn't been lived in for years. It was in terrible, dilapidated shape. It had been exposed to the elements. It was not livable in, but it was there.
Investigators hope this decrepit shack might still hold forensic evidence, even after all these years.
I certainly would expect that the space in which this woman was struck again and again with a blunt force object would have blood spattered around it. The scalp is very vascular. If you hit someone in the head and break the scalp, it's going to start to bleed. If you hit them again, you're going to be splattering blood.
There was an expert that we had used in another murder case, Dr. Laura Pepler, and we suggested at that point that they bring her in and let her take a look.
It was awful inside. There were all kinds of things like drug paraphernalia and condoms and snake skin. And there were holes to the floor. And I can just remember like stepping over these holes thinking, guys, is this floor going to give way?
Investigators fear the scene might be too messy to yield uncontaminated evidence.
I'm walking into the bedroom and I am looking around this dilapidated room that is completely exposed to the elements. And I'm running through my head at the same time, what is the best way to process this crime scene? We are going to have to use Blue Star. Blue Star technology is really cool. You spray it on some area that might look like it had been cleaned up, and blood is so resilient that the proteins oftentimes stick. Even if you clean something up with bleach. So when the chemical in Blue Star hits the surface, if there was blood on that surface, it lights up like a Christmas tree. It's going to find smaller traces of blood if there is blood in here, And that helps us pinpoint where the assault took place and maybe how much the victim bled before she was moved. We sprayed the ceiling and moved down the walls and then to the floor. And we found blood in all these different places. Someone was killed in that trailer and then dumped.
Investigators have found blood evidence in the trailer where Zilpha once visited prime suspects Robin Whitehead and Robert Taylor.
We see the bloodstains that were still on the ceiling, but it also showed where they had tried to wipe off the blood.
The trace evidence is sent to the laboratory for analysis.
They were able to extract the DNA from the bloodstains found in the trailer and compare it to Zilpha Lowry's DNA.
There was not a sufficient sample to match with Zilpha as, a 99.999% DNA match. But what it did was did not exclude her from providing that sample. There was another factor that made it more likely that the sample was from her. Most folks have either an XX or an XY chromosome. Some people have an extra allele. Zilpha had the extra allele.
The blood suggests Zilpha Lowry was assaulted in Robin and Bobby's trailer, but it's not conclusive evidence.
For the prosecutors, we realized whatever else happened, this case was going to rise and fall on Robin White.
Investigators press Robin for the truth.
He was burdened by this. He was troubled and wanted to try to do the right thing about this, but it was just having a hard time letting go and doing that.
When investigators inform Robin they found blood evidence in his old trailer, he finally breaks.
Robin told us, I saw Bobby kill her.
Robin said that on the night Zilpha disappeared, he had come home from work to the trailer that he shared with Robert Dean Taylor. And Robert Dean Taylor said that he had the name of a girl that they wanted to party with that night. And Zilpha came down and met them. That's when, as far as the rest of the world was concerned, Zilpha disappeared off the face of the earth.
They party well into the night. Zilpha became more interested in Robin, even though Bobby had been the one to ask her to come to the trailer to party.
And at some point, Robin goes into the bedroom with Zilpha and has sex with her. At that point, Robert Dean Taylor wants to have sex with Zilpha, but Zilpha wasn't interested.
He proceeded to take that rejection very personally. He took it so personally, he picked up probably the heaviest object he had in that bedroom and proceeded to beat Zilpha Lowry.
And Bobby ended up beating her to death there in the bedroom with the trailer.
At that point, Robert Dean Taylor coerced Robin Whitehead into helping him clean up the murder scene. They wrapped the body in a sheet or a towel and took it out to the truck. And Robin drove him up to Lake James.
Investigators arrest Robert Dean Taylor and Robin Whitehead.
People were still convinced that Eddie played a role, but it was surprising for these two. Because they were strangers to this county, nobody knew them.
For 14 long years, the medical examiner and investigators worked side by side to solve the vicious bludgeoning of a trusting young woman.
The office of the chief medical examiner is crucial to proving a case before a jury, because one of the elements that we have to prove as prosecutors is that whatever act a defendant did caused the death of that person.
One of the things that we can be valuable to in terms of helping law enforcement or the district attorney is to mesh the evidence that we have with their theory of what happened. The mystery solving aspect, the puzzle solving aspect is what intrigues us. In this case, as we look at Miss Lowry's head, the skull, we see that the bones are massively broken or fragmented. That there's been some severe trauma to the head. There are two ways to come into the world and an infinite number of ways to leave it.
To find blood at a crime scene all those years later and to know that it's going to mean justice for a victim and answers for a family that have been grieving and missing that person for more than a decade is just unexplainable. I get goosebumps even talking about it.
At trial, Robert Dean Taylor is found guilty of first-degree murder.
And he got life without parole, and there he is today. I have the most belief that there was an answer for this family, that someone was held accountable for the death of Zilpha Lowry.
Robin Whitehead pleads guilty to a charge of accessory after the fact. He is given a 3-year suspended sentence.
Finding out why people die solves an important human need. If one of our loved ones dies, we like to have some idea of why. And we provide some comfort to families by letting them know what happened and helping to prevent the next one.